Good evening and welcome back to the channel. This is our fourth episode. Part 4, An Expanding War, 1962. What you're about to hear is drawn directly from the official history of the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam, a 9-volume series researched and written by the Marine Corps History and Museums Division and published by the U.S. government. These aren't dramatizations or second-hand accounts. This is the Corps' own record of what happened, compiled from command diaries, after-action reports, oral histories, and the accounts of the men who were there. We'll be focusing on the years when Marine involvement was most intense, the advisory era of the early 1960s, the landing at Da Nang in 1965, the brutal fighting of 1966 and 1967, and the defining crucible of 1968. We'll follow Marines from the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta to the hills above Khe Sanh. Where possible, we will go into detail on specific actions and include additional references for you to dive deeper into this history. As always, if this content is to your liking, please ensure that you like and subscribe. The language is formal, the record is honest, and the story is remarkable. Let's begin. Part 4, An Expanding War, 1962. The war's new context and the creation of MACV. The war's new context. More than any previous year, 1962 was to be a period of deepened commitment for all participants in the continuing struggle for control of South Vietnam. On the American side, plans already set in motion by President Kennedy's recent decisions promised to loosen the flow of dollars, equipment, advisors, and combat support personnel to South Vietnam. Administration officials envisioned that this sharp influx of assistance would stimulate a redoubled war effort on the part of the Diem government. Viet Cong's strength and operational capabilities likewise were on the upswing as 1962 opened. U.S. and South Vietnamese sources were placing total Viet Cong military strength at roughly 25,000 men. Backing these military forces was a far greater number of sympathizers. American agencies tended to divide the communist military forces into 3 rough categories according to function and composition: main forces, local forces, and village activists. Thought to total around 9,000 men at the beginning of the year, the main forces constituted the pillar of communist military strength in the South. They were organized into approximately 20 small, 200 to 400 man, and highly mobile battalions and a number of independent companies. Main force units, as a rule, were cadred by North Vietnamese or returnees trained in the North, and were capable of conducting operations on an interprovincial scale. They often were referred to as interprovincial battalions and companies. Later in the war, Americans came to call the main forces hardcore units. Next in terms of operational capabilities were the Viet Cong local forces, whose aggregate strength stood at around 8,000 part-time but well-trained soldiers. The local forces were organized into platoons and companies which operated independently within their respective districts. Finally, there were some 8,000 village activists. Part-time guerrillas in the truest sense of the term, the activists commonly worked in the paddies by day and engaged in military pursuits at night. For the most part, their ranks were filled with men considered either too young or too old for service with organized Viet Cong military units. Nevertheless, they played an important role in the struggle for South Vietnam's rural areas by providing various forms of support for larger Viet Cong formations. Living and working within the rural hamlets and villages as they did, the activists were a ready source of intelligence information for the Viet Cong. Often they served as porters and guides for main force units which had been assigned to operate within their locale. Otherwise, the activists were responsible for defending their particular villages against the government's military and police forces, a defense which normally took the form of harassment with mines and sniper fire. The three-way division was the most commonly used method of categorizing the communist forces. See U.S. Army, the Viet Cong, page 152. A U.S. MAAG document published during this period, however, divided the Viet Cong into two somewhat broader categories: main forces and guerrillas. Both local force units and village activists were classified as guerrillas under this system. USMAAG, Vietnam, Tactics and Techniques of Counterinsurgent Operations, page 11 to 5. Other sources tended to make more elaborate divisions. See Pike, Viet Cong. After early 1962, the activities of these Viet Cong military and paramilitary forces were carefully coordinated with communist political activities on the national level by a Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN. COSVN apparently was established in March. Prior to this, the NLF had functioned through two separate geographic headquarters: Interzone 5, responsible for roughly the northern three-quarters of South Vietnam, and the Nambo Interzone, responsible for the area roughly described by the forested hills and Mekong Delta physiographic regions. From its headquarters, believed to have been located northeast of Saigon in Binh Duong Province, COSVN exercised direct control over 6 military regions, MRs. Designated MRS through MR9, arranged in a north to south pattern, with an additional Saigon Gia Dinh Special Zone, the communist military regions served essentially the same purpose as the government's core tactical zones. Within these 6 regions, COSVN utilized a province and district structure only slightly different from that of the Diem government to exercise administrative and military control. At each level within this organization, a small, disciplined communist political committee orchestrated the activities of its subordinate military units with the actions of its political apparatus. To counter the strengthened NLF organization and to satisfy American demands that he adopt some form of national strategy, President Diem launched one of the most controversial large-scale undertakings of the war, the Strategic Hamlet Program. Instituted on an informal basis in the closing stages of 1961, the program became fully operative in mid-1962. Although heralded as a new concept, the campaign actually grew out of an existing program whose broad objective had been to bring improved economic and social conditions to South Vietnam's rural areas. Named the Agroville Program, this effort had been in effect since late 1959 under the direction of Diem and Nhu, the president's brother and principal advisor. Since its institution, however, the program had achieved little aside from the resettlement of many rural families into government-constructed communities. Few meaningful reforms, either social or economic, had been realized. During the early 1960s, moreover, many of the agrovilles had been victimized by the Viet Cong, who saw the developments as symbols of the government's presence in contested areas. By mid-1961, in an effort to protect the more remote agrovilles, authorities in several provinces had begun fortifying the otherwise helpless population centers. Concurrent with this evolution of the agrovilles into fortified communities, Sir Robert G.K. Thompson, the head of a newly formed British advisory mission in Saigon, suggested that President Diem consider adopting a similar scheme with broader strategic objectives. Thompson, who had helped implement such an effort in Malaya in the 1950s during the struggle there against communist insurgents, specifically proposed that the South Vietnamese integrate various economic and social programs into an effective campaign to reestablish its influence in the heavily populated Mekong Delta. This campaign, Thompson advised, should lead by stages to a reorganization of the government machinery for directing and coordinating all action against the communists, and the production of an overall strategic operational plan for the country as a whole. 1. Under pressure from the U.S. Embassy to develop some sort of national strategy for countering the insurgency, President Diem accepted the concept of Thompson's proposal. Shortly thereafter, Diem named Diem and Nhu to head a campaign formally designated the Strategic Hamlet Program. Nhu was instructed to plan the program and to create a combined agency that would ensure its coordination within the various government ministries. These instructions resulted in the creation, in February, of the Interministerial Committee for Strategic Hamlets. A counterpart American organization, the U.S. Interagency Committee for Province Rehabilitation, was formed in April to provide assistance to Nhu's agency. With advice from Thompson and the U.S. Embassy, the Vietnamese formulated a program which in theory was to evolve in several rather distinct phases. First, it would be necessary to select specific geographic areas wherein the Strategic Hamlet Program would be implemented. Once specific objective areas had been established, regular military units would initiate operations to clear those areas of Viet Cong formations. Following the completion of these operations, RVNAF units would resettle the inhabitants of the area in fortified hamlets. Initially, these hamlets were to be defended by civil guard units, while regular forces continued screening operations in the surrounding countryside. In the final phase, self-defense corps units would assume responsibility for local security, while regular units continued to screen Viet Cong forces from the developments. During this phase, district civil authorities would initiate economic and social programs within the newly formed communities in an effort to recapture the allegiance of the local populace. Thus, in this final phase, it was expected that the communist political infrastructure would be broken. Following the pacification of a few contiguous hamlets, the same process was to be repeated over and over in an expanding pattern. In this manner, Diem hoped to expand the GVN's control progressively outward from the initial secure hamlets over large areas of the countryside. Ultimately, the GVN intended to construct nearly 11,000 such protected communities in several of the country's most critical rural areas. A principal shortcoming of this method of pacification was that the success of the entire program within a specific area depended on the successful completion of virtually every developmental phase in every strategic hamlet. Should the communist infrastructure remain intact in even one hamlet, that hamlet could precipitate the collapse of the entire campaign by contaminating the surrounding communities in a geometric progression. Given this critical requirement that all phases be accomplished in a deliberate and orderly manner, it was unfortunate that Nhu initiated the program in an uncoordinated fashion. By the first of the year, months before the appropriate American and South Vietnamese agencies had been formed to guide the program, the construction of hamlets had begun on a scale which already suggested a nationwide campaign. Furthermore, the government failed to test the plan in a pilot project such as Thompson, as well as U.S. advisors, had recommended. Instead, it launched rather extensive campaigns simultaneously in several traditional communist strongholds during the spring of 1962. Nevertheless, once formally initiated, the Strategic Hamlet Program constituted the government's first real effort to implement a concerted counterinsurgency strategy on a national scale. Regardless of its weaknesses and its somewhat abortive start, the program would serve as the context within which the Diem government would wage its battle with the Viet Cong during 1962 and most of 1963. From this military standpoint, moreover, Diem's adoption of the Strategic Hamlet Program marked somewhat of a watershed in the evolution of ground strategy in the Vietnam War. Inherent in its selection was the decision to opt for a clear and hold as opposed to a search and destroy strategy. In accordance with the dictates of the pacification campaign, RVNAF ground forces would focus primarily during the next 2 years on operations to clear communist military formations from the more densely populated rural areas. The creation of MACV and Marine Advisory Division. The American military buildup called for by the Washington decisions of December 1961 was well underway as the new year opened. Several U.S. units introduced in the closing weeks of 1961 had already begun operations by January. These included 2 U.S. Army transport helicopter companies and a composite U.S. Air Force detachment. Designated Farmgate and composed initially of 151 officers and men, the Air Force detachment had a dual mission of training VNAF elements and conducting attack sorties in support of President Diem's forces. The arrival of another U.S. Air Force unit, a C-123 transport squadron, another Army helicopter company, and an Army communications organization, the 3D Radio Research Unit, just after the first of the year, raised the number of American military personnel serving on permanent assignment in Vietnam to over 3,000. Assigned to the Army's radio unit, which immediately began operations from Pleiku in 2nd Corps Tactical Zone, were 42 Marines from the 1st Radio Company, FMF. Designated Detachment A, 1st Radio Company, these were the first U.S. Marines to participate in the ongoing buildup. Thus far, however, the U.S. troops arriving in Vietnam were for combat support rather than advisory-type duty. At a meeting held in Honolulu in mid-January, Secretary of Defense McNamara ordered the ranking American military officials concerned with Vietnam to make substantial increases in the number of advisors serving with the Vietnamese armed forces. Less than a month after the Honolulu conference, a new U.S. command was created in Saigon to manage the expected influx of advisors and the intensified military assistance effort more efficiently. On 8 February, the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, U.S. MACV or MACV, supplanted the MAG as the senior American command in the Republic of Vietnam. Its commander, Army General Paul D. Harkins, COM U.S. MACV, assumed direct responsibility for all U.S. military policy, operations, and assistance to President Diem's government. Harkins was directly subordinate to the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, Admiral Harry D. Felt, whose headquarters was in Hawaii. The number of U.S. Marines assigned to MACV's staff indicated that they would play an important role in its operations. In all, 21 staff billets in the new command were allocated to the Marine Corps. The most important of these was the Chief of Staff billet. This assignment went to Major General Richard G. Weed, a veteran who had commanded an artillery battalion during the campaigns for Saipan and Okinawa during World War II. Later, in Korea, he had distinguished himself as the commander of the 5th Marines. Weed arrived in Saigon from Hawaii, where he had commanded the 1st Marine Brigade since 1959. Other Marines joined General Harkins' command as Deputy Chief of Staff, J2, and as branch chiefs for the J3 through J6 divisions. 2 other positions assigned to Marine officers were the Project Officer for a Joint Operations Evaluation Group and a Research and Development Project Officer for a Department of Defense agency. Both of these were operationally controlled by the newly organized Military Assistance Command. Under the new U.S. command arrangement, the old Military Assistance Advisory Group became subordinate to General Harkins' command. Headed by Major General Charles J. Timms, U.S. Army, the MAG was now responsible primarily for the advisory aspect of the assistance program. To accommodate the impending increases in the number of advisors, the MAG's staff was restructured. Under its new table of organization, Marine officers were to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff and head of the Plans Branch of the J3 Division. Later, in 1963, the MAG's table of distribution would be modified with the effect that the Chief of Staff billet would be held by a Marine colonel. The first Marine to serve as General Tim's Chief of Staff would be Colonel Earl E. Anderson, a much-decorated aviator who eventually would become the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. The reorganization of the MAG brought about a dramatic change in the size and scope of the U.S. Marine advisory effort. The new table of organization included a provision for an 18-man Marine Advisory Division within the MAG's Naval Section. The organizational charts for this division included advisor billets for a lieutenant colonel, a major, 6 captains, a gunnery sergeant, and 4 staff sergeants. Administrative positions were to make up the balance of the new organization. As had been the case previous to this expansion, the lieutenant colonel was to serve as the senior Marine advisor to the Vietnamese Marine Corps. The inclusion of the major's billet was expected to enhance the overall effectiveness of the advisory division, as he was to double as assistant senior advisor and as senior artillery advisor. The gunnery sergeant was to assist in the artillery advisory duties. Of the 6 captains, 4 were to be assigned as advisors to VNMC infantry battalions, while the 2 others were slated to advise on engineer and supply matters. The 4 logistics-trained staff sergeants were to be assigned as assistant infantry battalion advisors and were expected to free the officer advisors from direct involvement in time-consuming supply matters. Marines required to man this enlarged advisory unit began arriving in Vietnam as early as February. All of the new officer advisors were graduates of either junior school at Marine Corps schools, Quantico, or the U.S. Army Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Following their assignments, but before departing for Vietnam, many advisors received schooling in military assistance operations. This normally included a 5-month course of instruction in the French language, a requirement which more and more Marine advisors were beginning to question as a result of the Vietnamese desire to converse in their own language rather than French. Upon arrival in Saigon, the Marines were given 2 days of orientation briefings at MACV headquarters before assuming their jobs in the Marine Advisory Division. Lieutenant Colonel Brown continued to serve as the senior Marine advisor and headed the new advisory division throughout the summer of 1962. In October, he was relieved by Lieutenant Colonel Clarence G. Moody, Jr., a veteran who held the Navy Cross for heroism as a company commander during the Korean War. Having served with the British Royal Marines following Korea, Moody was somewhat familiar with the problems involved in dealing with foreign military services. Encouraged by both Brown and Moody, the U.S. Marine advisors participated in every combat operation undertaken by the VNMC during 1962. Prior to planned operations, they helped their Vietnamese counterparts coordinate the more sophisticated means of support which became available as the American military buildup took hold. During planning phases, for example, they assisted with the development of detailed orders and helped plan for employing artillery fire and air support. If the impending operation was to be amphibious in nature, the Marine officers coordinated with the U.S. Navy advisors assigned to the supporting Vietnamese Navy units, thereby ensuring that planning for embarkation had been accomplished. On occasion, the advisors were required to coordinate helicopter support for the VNMC units, a task sometimes complicated by the Vietnamese Marines' lack of experience in heliborne operations. Unfortunately, the almost constant combat assignments being drawn by the handful of U.S. and VNAF helicopter units available in Vietnam made training in such operations impossible. Even more difficult were the advisors' responsibilities after their units deployed to combat. The U.S. Marines were experiencing the often frustrating task of actually searching out the elusive Viet Cong on a continuing daily basis. Additionally, the Americans found themselves faced with the unenviable task of advising Vietnamese officers who in some cases had been fighting communist guerrillas since the French Indochina War. These circumstances presented a unique set of challenges for the advisors. For American officers with relatively little actual experience in this brand of warfare to offer tactical advice in a form acceptable to their Vietnamese counterparts demanded a combination of tact, patience, and subtle persuasive powers. The U.S. Marine advisors quickly learned that success in this peculiar assignment depended largely on the degree of respect they commanded among the Vietnamese Marines. To help build this intangible yet vital foundation of mutual understanding and confidence, the Marine advisors stayed with their units in combat, sharing with the Vietnamese Marine the same foods, the same dangers, the same discomforts, and the same routines. The Marine advisors lived in U.S. bachelor quarters in Saigon when their respective battalions were in garrison. Nevertheless, they spent much of this time at the Marine base camps, inspecting troops and equipment and making preparations for the battalion's next combat assignment. Among others, Lieutenant Colonels Brown and Moody viewed this continuous association with the Vietnamese Marines as the single most essential ingredient to a successful advisory program. The Vietnamese Marine Corps, 1962. For the Vietnamese Marine Corps, 1962 was characterized by expansion, redesignation, and continued combat operations against the Viet Cong. On 1 January, the former Vietnamese Marine Group was redesignated to Vietnamese Marine Brigade and was enlarged to 5,483 officers and men. Under its new table of organization, the number of infantry battalions remained at 4, but 2 new battalions were added. 1 battery of 8 105mm howitzers, 2 batteries of 8 75mm pack howitzers, and a headquarters and service battery comprised an artillery battalion which was created to provide artillery fire support to the infantry units. An amphibious support battalion of 1,038 officers and men was also formed. This unit contained the personnel necessary to provide the entire Marine Brigade with reconnaissance, communications, motor transport, medical, engineer, and training support. Lieutenant Colonel Cong continued in his position as Commandant of the expanded and restructured Vietnamese Marine Corps. The infantry battalions of the Vietnamese Marine Brigade performed a variety of combat missions ranging from security duty around key government installations to helicopter landings in suspected Viet Cong redoubts during 1962. The 4 infantry battalions, the 4th Battalion became available for combat assignment at mid-year, participated in 23 combat operations which involved 404 days in the field. These operations included 12 amphibious landings and 8 heliborne assaults. With the exception of 2 howitzer batteries, which saw some combat, the artillery battalion devoted the year to training. Supervised by Major Alfred J. Croft and Gunnery Sergeant William A. Loico, their new Marine advisors, the Vietnamese artillerymen learned their skills in a number of field firing exercises conducted on ARVN artillery ranges. In terms of casualties, the VNMC battalions fought no major engagements with the Communists during the year. A typical operation was one conducted in An Xuyen, South Vietnam's southernmost province, early in the year. The Tude Battalion, which was assigned to the An Xuyen province chief for the period between 18 February and 26 April, conducted 1 helicopter landing, provided troop escorts for numerous truck convoys, and fought several minor engagements with the Viet Cong. Although the Vietnamese commander reported 112 enemy killed and another 40 wounded during the 2-month assignment, the figures contradicted those of Captain Evan L. Parker, the Marine advisor, which placed the Viet Cong casualties at about 40 dead and 20 wounded. This difference, which was not uncommon, stemmed largely from the fact that the Marine advisors limited their reports to enemy dead and wounded actually sighted. Still, the conflicting reports sometimes led to tensions between the Vietnamese commander and the Marine advisor. In other instances, the Vietnamese Marine battalions were ordered to serve as the reserve force for one of the 3 core tactical zones. The 1st Battalion, for example, accompanied by Captain Bradley S. Snell, assumed the mission as 2nd Corps Reserve on 16 May and remained in that role until mid-September. Based at Ban Me Tuot, deep in the Central Highlands, the battalion provided security for government installations while remaining ready to react to enemy threats. As the Corps Reserve, it conducted 1 heliborne operation and several search-type missions. In one of these searches, the Vietnamese Marines uncovered and destroyed a Viet Cong small arms factory. During its assignment in 2nd Corps, the 1st Battalion accounted for only 4 Viet Cong dead and 1 wounded, while suffering 16 dead and 28 wounded. These statistics attested both to the grim effectiveness of enemy sniper fire and mines, and to the enemy's elusiveness. The newly activated 4th Battalion, advised by Captain Don R. Christensen, entered combat for the first time during an operation in Binh Thuan Province in the first week in August. Supported by Battery A, a 75mm howitzer unit, of the Artillery Battalion, it joined the 43rd ARVN Infantry Regiment in an attempt to locate and destroy Viet Cong forces operating around Phan Thiet, the provincial capital, located on the coast 95 miles east of Saigon. Following the conclusion of this operation on 22 August, the Marine units reverted to the control of the Binh Thuan Province chief. In this capacity, they assisted in clearing and resettlement operations being conducted in conjunction with the Strategic Hamlet Program. Between 4 August and 15 October, when its assignment in the province ended, the 4th Battalion reported 12 Viet Cong killed and 7 captured. Vietnamese Marine casualties were 1 killed and 5 wounded. During the assignment, the Marines resettled some 600 civilians in fortified hamlets. In the last week of September, General David M. Shoup, Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, arrived in Saigon to begin a 4-day tour of South Vietnam. Shoup, who held the Medal of Honor for his actions as a regimental commander on Tarawa in World War II, was recognized as one of President Kennedy's most trusted military advisors. Acting in his role as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Commandant was scheduled to visit a number of U.S. and South Vietnamese installations, including several strategic hamlets. After a series of briefings at MACV and MAG headquarters in Saigon, the Commandant and his party journeyed by automobile to the base camp of the 3rd Vietnamese Marine Battalion at Thu Duc on the outskirts of the capital. There, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonels Brown and Cang, Shoup reviewed a Vietnamese Marine Honor Guard and inspected the 3rd Battalion. Impressed with the units he had seen, General Shoup commended President Diem on the status of his Marine Brigade. "From my observation," he wrote from Washington, "the Vietnamese Marine Corps is in an excellent state of readiness from the standpoint of equipment as well as the degree of training of its members. Indeed," he added, "your Corps of Marines seem to be a splendid and competent fighting organization." The Commandant was less complimentary of the Strategic Hamlet Program. After visiting several of the developments, he concluded that the government's effort to concentrate the Vietnamese civilians into defended communities was counterproductive to the program's stated objective of winning the allegiance of the rural population. As Shoup reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff upon his return to Washington, the forced resettlement of the peasants from their native hamlets and villages into what amounted to fortified camps seemed to be generating antagonism rather than goodwill. At the close of 1962, Vietnamese Marine commanders reported a total of 192 Viet Cong killed, 77 wounded, and another 158 taken prisoner. U.S. Marine advisors felt that even these moderate figures were inflated. They estimated that only about 98 enemy soldiers had been killed, 27 wounded, and roughly half as many actual Viet Cong captured as had been reported by their Vietnamese Marine counterparts. The Vietnamese Marines also had failed to inflict any serious damage on the enemy's logistic system, capturing only 16,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 45 grenades, 31 mines, and 50 individual weapons, a printing press, 2 typewriters, several motors, and an assortment of medical supplies. Major Croft, the assistant senior Marine advisor during this period, later recalled that province chiefs tended to misuse the Marine units by assigning them unproductive missions such as static security. Colonel Alfred J. Croft comments on 2nd Draft MS, Whitlow, Marine Activities in Vietnam, 1954 to 1964, hereafter Croft comments. Some conclusions. In retrospect, 1962 bears assessment as an important watershed in the chronicle of U.S. Marine activities in Vietnam. As the year began, only 3 Marine advisors and a handful of embassy guards were serving in the Republic. The initial months, however, brought a dramatic expansion of that role, both in terms of numbers and responsibilities. By March, Marines were functioning on MAG and MACV staffs in Saigon, in U.S. Army communications facilities in the Central Highlands, and throughout the provinces where Vietnamese Marine units operated. Their contributions to the war effort, therefore, were broad and varied, ranging from high-level planning to infantry advisory duties. The Marine role had expanded in rough proportion to the broad-based expansion of the overall U.S. military assistance program. In this connection, Marine contributions tended to be concealed within the context of the American assistance effort. Still, by mid-1962, it could be said that the Marines in Vietnam were leaving the impact of their service on virtually every stage of the ground war. Chefly at Soc Trang. The decision, deployment to Soc Trang, Mekong Delta operations, preparations and redeployment accomplishments. One of the most important developments in the chronicle of U.S. Marine activities in South Vietnam during the early 1960s occurred shortly after the creation of MACV. In mid-April 1962, a Marine medium helicopter squadron was deployed to the Mekong Delta to provide support for the government of Vietnam forces in their battle with the communist guerrillas. The significance of the squadron's arrival went beyond the added mobility that it afforded those Vietnamese units attempting to hold the rice-producing Delta region. Coinciding as it did with the increases in the number of Marines serving on the MACV staff and under the MAG, its arrival indicated that the Marine role would expand in direct proportion to the widening U.S. effort to defend the Republic of Vietnam. The decision. The decision to deploy the Marine Aviation Unit to the combat zone originated in the immediate aftermath of General Taylor's report to President Kennedy. On 17 January 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, CINCPAC, Admiral Harry D. Felt, to prepare for increased operations in South Vietnam. This order implied that the Pacific Command should stand ready to deploy additional helicopter units to Diem's Republic in the event that it became necessary to augment the Army companies already operating there. By now, the number of Army helicopter companies in South Vietnam stood at 3. CINCPAC was also instructed to explore South Vietnam's requirements for additional helicopter units beyond the Army companies already present. Shortly afterward, Admiral Felt advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff that a valid requirement for additional helicopter support did exist in the Mekong Delta region of South Vietnam. He recommended that a 4th U.S. Army light helicopter company be deployed to the area. Included in the Admiral's recommendation was a proposal to support the aviation unit with a composite maintenance, avionics, and medical group. Admiral Felt's recommendations were approved by the Secretary of Defense on 6 March. The Joint Chiefs immediately assigned the responsibility for providing the support package and helicopter unit to the Army. In turn, Army authorities alerted the 33rd Transportation Light Helicopter Company at Fort Ord, California, for the move. Its departure date was set for 18 April. Unknown to the officers and men of the alerted unit, the plans for its deployment to combat were being reconsidered at the time the orders were received. 2 days before Admiral Felt's recommendation reached the Joint Chiefs, a proposal to augment Army helicopter units with Marine pilots had been advanced by General Timms, the MAG chief. This proposal triggered a brief but eventful debate within U.S. military circles. With General Harkin's concurrence, Timms recommended that 9 Marine helicopter pilots be assigned to the Army aviation units in Vietnam for periods of 60 to 90 days. This arrangement, he pointed out, would enable the Marine pilots to become familiar with the nature of the combat support operations in South Vietnam and would provide them with transitional training in the Army's Piasecki-built tandem-rotored H-21 helicopter, nicknamed the Flying Banana. Admiral Felt turned to the Commanding General, Fleet Marine Force Pacific, FMFPAC, Lieutenant General Alan Shapley, for his comments on the MAG chief's plan. Shapley in turn instructed Major General Carson A. Roberts, the Commanding General, Aircraft, FMFPAC, to study the proposal and to frame a set of recommendations. Roberts, who had been selected for promotion to Lieutenant General and was scheduled to relieve Shapley as Commanding General, FMFPAC, found the prospect of Marine aviators participating in combat support operations in Vietnam appealing, but felt that the proposal under review had some definite disadvantages. He pointed out that under Tim's plan, the Marine pilots would be flying a type of helicopter unfamiliar to them instead of the ones they would operate if the Marine squadrons were later deployed to Vietnam.
Furthermore, General Roberts warned that the piecemeal assignment of his pilots would reduce the combat readiness of the unit from which they would be drawn. At Roberts' suggestion, General Shapley offered CINCPAC a counter-proposal which he believed would benefit both the South Vietnamese government and the Marine Corps. He suggested that a complete Marine medium helicopter squadron from Marine Aircraft Group 16, MAG 16, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, 1st MAW, and supporting elements be moved from Okinawa to the war zone. The Marine Squadron, operating 24 HUS-1s, a single-rotor, Sikorsky-built transport helicopter later known as the UH-34D, would replace the Army Helicopter Company at Da Nang in the northernmost Corps Tactical Zone, 1 Corps. The Army unit would then be freed for redeployment southward into either 2nd or 3 Corps tactical zones. General Shapley emphasized several advantages which he saw in this plan. First, it would provide additional helicopter support for the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, while concurrently providing an entire Marine helicopter squadron with an opportunity to gain first-hand experience in a counter-guerrilla environment. It would also provide Marine Corps units with operational experience in Fur Corps, the area to which they would be committed if standing contingency plans were later executed. Finally, Shapley explained that his proposal offered an almost entirely self-sufficient aviation unit, which could be supported administratively and logistically by the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. The unit would require only minimal support from the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. On the same day that he had heard the Marine commander's proposal, Admiral Felt received a message from Admiral John H. Sides, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, which strongly advised that Roberts' plan be implemented. Admiral Felt then solicited General Harkin's opinion on the matter. He reminded the MACV commander that the proposed deployment would provide the Marines with operational experience in an area where they might someday be committed. The admiral further pointed out that the location of a Marine helicopter unit at Da Nang would enable the Army aviation companies to move south into one of the other core tactical zones, a move that would facilitate the logistical support of those units by shortening their supply lines. Harkins generally concurred with Admiral Felt's viewpoint. He noted that the more powerful Marine HUS helicopter, Seahorse, could be expected to outperform the Army's H-21 in the higher elevations around Da Nang. He also felt that the Marines, with their seaborne supply network, were better equipped to cope with the logistics problems in the more isolated northern reaches of South Vietnam. But he objected to the deployment of the Marine unit to Da Nang on the basis that the relocation of the Army's 93D helicopter company from 1st Corps in the immediate future would disrupt a series of operations which were already underway in Fur Corps. As an alternative, General Harkins proposed that the Marine helicopters be located initially at Soc Trang in the Mekong Delta. Later, when the tempo of operations in the Northern Corps Tactical Zone permitted, it could exchange places with the Army unit at Da Nang. One Army general raised a specific objection to the proposal that the Marine Squadron be deployed from Okinawa. General James F. Collins, the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Army Pacific, SINCSI USAR PAC, argued that the presence of the Marine helicopters at Soc Trang would introduce yet another supply and maintenance feature into the 3rd Corps area. This argument was followed by the recommendation that the Army's 81st Light Helicopter Company, then based in Hawaii, be ordered to the Mekong Delta. The 81st, General Collins contended, was already trained in troop transportation operations in jungle terrain. General David M. Shoup, the Marine Corps Commandant, who approved the FM-FPAC plan in concept, harbored one reservation regarding General Roberts' proposals. His concerns stemmed from the possibility that the Marine Corps might be required to replace the squadron from Okinawa with another in order to maintain the level of operational forces available to SINCPAC, an eventuality which would upset long-range Marine Corps deployment schedules. General Shoup indicated that he, too, would oppose the deployment of a Marine helicopter squadron to South Vietnam if this proved to be the case. At this juncture in the debate, Admiral Felt journeyed to Saigon to discuss the matter more thoroughly with General Harkins. Following consultations, the two commanders jointly communicated their recommendations to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on 14th March. They advised that it would be more desirable to deploy one of the Marine helicopter squadrons from Okinawa than either the Army unit already on alert in California or the one in Hawaii. This decision, Felt and Harkins informed the Joint Chiefs, was influenced heavily by the readiness posture of the various units under consideration. A Marine squadron, they pointed out, could be on station and ready for combat operations by 15th April, 3 days before the company already alerted by the Army could depart California. Admiral Felt and General Harkins then dealt with the SINC-SARPAC contention that additional supply problems would be created by the deployment of a Marine unit to the Mekong Delta. The Pacific commanders advised that, in their opinion, the logistical support can be handled relatively easily by the Marines. They added that, should requirements for a 5th helicopter unit arise in South Vietnam, the Army's 81st Helicopter Company would be selected for the assignment. It would be replaced in Hawaii by the 33rd Transportation Light Helicopter Company from Fort Ord. Finally, Admiral Felt and General Harkins recommended that the Marine Squadron be deployed initially to the Mekong Delta area of 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, 3 CTZ. Later, when operational conditions in Fur Corps were more favorable, the Marines could replace the Army helicopter unit there. After meeting to discuss the matter, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the entire package of recommendations on 16th March. Admiral Felt immediately ordered the Pacific Fleet to deploy a Marine helicopter squadron to South Vietnam and authorized direct liaison between the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing and COMU's MACV. In turn, Admiral Sides, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, notified the commander, 7th Fleet, Vice Admiral William A. Scheck, of the decision and directed him to take appropriate action. Deployment to Soc Trang. The commanding general of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, Major General John P. Condon, a Michigan native who had earned a Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 Legions of Merit for service during World War II and Korea, was informed of the impending deployment on 22nd March. At the time, Condon, his staff, and elements of his command were participating in SEATO exercise Tulungan in the Philippines. The arrival of the orders proved timely, for most of the affected units were in close proximity to the wing commander. As the Marine Helicopter Squadron and its supporting elements were scheduled to arrive in Vietnam just 2 weeks after the SEATO exercise ended, preparations for the move were begun immediately. General Condon quickly dispatched several officers to Saigon to establish liaison with USMACV. The 1st Marine Aircraft Wing fortunately possessed a background which facilitated the rapid preparations for the movement. Since August of the previous year, General Condon's command regularly had deployed a medium helicopter squadron, HMM, and its supporting elements with the Special Landing Force, SLF, a Marine air-ground team embarked on board the 7th Fleet's Amphibious Ready Group. Since 1961, this naval task force had cruised Southeast Asian waters ready to implement U.S. contingency plans. These deployments had given the Marines of the wing a reservoir of experience, which enabled them to make maximum use of the short period of time available for planning. By 30th March, the wing's planning had progressed to the stage that General Condon could provide the commander of the 7th Fleet with specific recommendations for the entire operation. The general concept of the plan was that Task Unit 79.3.5, under the command of a Marine colonel, was to be built around a Marine medium helicopter squadron which was participating in Operation Tulungan. This task unit, codenamed Shu Fly, was to occupy an old Japanese-built landing strip near Soc Trang, a small town located about 85 miles southwest of Saigon in Ba Jian Province. Situated only 20 miles from the coast, Soc Trang possessed one of the few hard-surfaced runways in the area. Condon informed the 7th Fleet commander of the arrangements which his liaison officers had made during their trip to Saigon. An ARVN infantry battalion and 2 4.2-inch mortar companies were to assume the defense of the airstrip at Soc Trang the same day that the Marines began landing. The Marine general then proceeded to outline the chain of command and method of support which he considered best for the Marine task unit. Shufly, he suggested, should be under the operational control of COM-US MACV, but should remain under the administrative control of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. Most of its logistic support, the wing commander thought, could come through normal Marine and Navy channels, with fuels, lubricant oils, rations, and ammunition being the exceptions. Rations and ammunition were to be provided by MACV, while fuels would be supplied by private Vietnamese distributors operating under contracts with the U.S. government. Next, General Condon explained to Admiral Scheck his desires for the organization of the task unit. He felt that Shoo-Fly would function best if organized into 3 distinct task elements. First, he proposed that a headquarters be formed under the command of Colonel John F. Carey, a veteran Marine aviator who had been awarded the Navy Cross for heroism during the Battle for Midway. Carey was currently serving as Chief of Staff of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. This headquarters, General Condon advised, should consist of 8 officers and 6 enlisted men. The second element of the task unit, the wing commander continued, would be Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 362, HMM 362, reinforced under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Archie J. Clapp. The squadron, whose normal complement was 63 officers and 196 enlisted Marines, was to be augmented by 50 additional maintenance personnel. Its equipment would include 24 HUS helicopters, which under normal operating conditions could lift 8 to 12 combat-loaded Vietnamese troops. 3 Cessna single-engine OE-1 observation aircraft, 1 R-4D transport aircraft, and supplemental maintenance equipment. Prior to its deployment, HMM 362 would exchange its helicopters for recently overhauled aircraft in order to reduce maintenance problems once operations in Vietnam began. Shoo-Fly's third element would be a subunit of Marine Air Base Squadron 16, MABS 16. Designated Task Element 79.3.5.2, it would be commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William W. Eldridge. Navy medical, dental, and chaplain personnel would be included in the subunit's 193 enlisted men and 18 officers. The wing commander intended to provide the MABS-16 subunit with a Tactical Airfield Fuel Dispensing System, TAFDS, and a Marine Airfield Traffic Control Unit, MATCU. The Traffic Control Unit would be equipped with Tactical Air Navigation, TACAN, and Ground Control Approach, GCA, systems, which would enable the helicopter squadron to conduct landings during periods of reduced visibility. Colonel Carey, the task unit commander, was to be assigned responsibility for liaison with MACV and military authorities in 3 corps, the tactical zone, which encompassed the entire Mekong Delta and the transition zone between the Delta and the Highlands. All operational planning, security, external communications, and administrative matters also were to fall under his cognizance. This arrangement would allow Lieutenant Colonel Clapp and his squadron to concentrate on daily flight operations and aircraft maintenance. Lieutenant Colonel Eldridge's MABS-16 subunit would be responsible for all normal base support and airfield operations. General Condon's report to Admiral Scheck concluded with a rough outline of the schedule for the task unit's deployment. On the 9 April, only 8 days after the termination of the CETO exercise in the Philippines, Marine transport aircraft from the 1st MAW, augmented by 3 transports from the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, 3rd MAW, would begin airlifting the task unit headquarters and the MABS-16 detachment from Okinawa. The Marine General anticipated that all housekeeping facilities would be in position at Soc Trang within 5 days. Lieutenant Colonel Clapp's HMM 362 would fly into Soc Trang from the amphibious assault ship, helicopter carrier, USS Princeton, LPH-5, on the morning of 15th April. The proposal that the helicopters be flown ashore satisfied a Department of Defense requirement that conspicuous unloading activities were to be avoided in the Saigon area. Admiral Scheck approved the 1st MAW's proposed plan on 3 April and ordered Task Unit 79.3.5
to be transferred to General Harkin's command on 15th April. He then instructed the commander, Task Group 76.5, the Amphibious Ready Group, to provide Scheffley with whatever supply and administrative support it might require for the movement. At the same time, the fleet commander ordered appropriate subordinate commanders to provide an escort of destroyers for the USS Princeton and an inconspicuous air cover when the LPH arrived and began unloading HMM 362. Accordingly, the covering aircraft were instructed not to approach within 20 miles of South Vietnam unless the situation around Soc Trang endangered the Marine helicopters. The day following Scheck's approval of the Marine plan, the Carrier Task Unit was formed to transport HMM 362 to South Vietnam. Scheffley was activated simultaneously and given orders which reflected General Condon's planning. Colonel Carey was instructed to establish his headquarters at the Marine Corps Air Station, Iwakuni, Japan, in order to prepare for the deployment. The task unit commander was advised that he would receive more detailed instructions relative to administration and logistics at a later date. Colonel Carey's task group headquarters in Japan had only 1 week in which to complete preparations for the move to the Republic of Vietnam. His staff's responsibility for coordinating between units located at Atsugi, Japan, and Futama, Okinawa, made this task even more difficult. Carey's officers worked out the details of the airlift with the staff of Marine Aerial Refueler Transport Squadron 152, VMGR 152, the GV-1 Star unit assigned to carry the MAB-16 subunit, and the task unit headquarters to Soc Trang. The airlift portion of the movement began as scheduled on 9th April, with the MAB-16 detachment being transported from Futama directly to Soc Trang. At 0800, Colonel Carey and part of his staff landed at Soc Trang in a twin-engine Douglas R-4D Skytrain. As planned, the 400-man ARVN Battalion had already established a perimeter around the airfield. Using the R-4D's radio, the crew provided landing instructions for the GVLs of VMGR 152 and VMGR 352, which began landing and unloading their cargoes at half-hour intervals. Several key American and Vietnamese military officers were on hand to watch the lead elements of Scheffley arrive. Major General Condon, the 1st MAW commander, flew the first GV-1 into Soc Trang, but departed after the aircraft had been unloaded. General Harkins and Brigadier General Lu Van Nguyen, the Vietnamese commander of 3rd Corps, also made appearances at the airstrip to welcome Colonel Carey and his Marines. Lieutenant Colonel Eldridge MAB-16 detachment began readying the airfield for HMM 362's arrival shortly after the first transport aircraft had unloaded. To serve as living spaces, the Marines raised 75 strong-back tents, all with plywood decks. They set up a water purification system and began trucking water from the town of Soc Trang, about 2.5 miles away. Within 2 days, 9,000 gallons of water had been purified. Other conveniences improved the camp's living conditions. A field laundry and a mess hale were set up, and by 12th April, hot meals were being served to the Marines. A post office began operations, and telephones were installed to connect living and working areas. By 14th April, the day before HMM 362 was scheduled to arrive at Soc Trang, most of the airfield facilities were ready to support flight operations. An old hangar, which had been constructed by the Japanese during their World War II occupation of Indochina, had been repaired to house some of the squadron's aircraft and equipment. The MAB's-16 communications section was operational and had established radio and teletype links with MACV in Saigon and MAG-16 on Okinawa. The TAFDS had been assembled and filled with aviation fuel, and MACV 68, the air traffic control unit assigned to Shuffly, was prepared to control flight operations.